You can hear me okay, I assume, right?
I can hear you just fine. Hey guys, we're here on the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Shawn Baker. You probably heard him on the Joe Rogan podcast. You've probably heard him on Vinny Tortorich's podcast a couple times. He's got his own podcast, the Human Performance Outliers podcast, which is one of those. I've got 3 or 4 podcasts that I don't miss, that can't miss for me every week, and his is definitely one of them. So I'm so excited to get him here on the show today to talk about his experiences with the carnivore diet. He's got a new book out that we're going to talk about in this interview. Lots of stuff are about to happen. So, Dr. Baker, welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So I'm real familiar with you, with the things that you've done over the last couple of years. So I am excited to finally get to answer some questions that I have that I know some of my readers or listeners have. And but before we get into that, your story a little bit. How did you? And I don't think maybe I've ever really heard this. How did you figure out that the carnivore diet was going to be a really good option for you?
Well, I mean, it was just basically trial and error. I mean, I
Okay.
didn't sort of theoretically assume that this is the way everybody should eat or I should eat. I mean, I just kind of went through this nearly decade-long journey of experimenting with different diets. You know, as I got into my 40s, you know, I'd been an athlete my whole life. Obviously, as a physician, you know, you sort of deal with disease and disability and physiology day in and day out. And I started to, you know, take nutrition more seriously as I saw my own health start to decline. You know, despite, you know, still really training at a very high level, but I was just seeing these sort of diseases of aging start to occur, and I wasn't particularly happy with it. So I went on just a nutritional journey, you know, and I went through a whole variety of different diets, you know, from a low fat, high fiber, you know, lean protein diet to a paleo diet, to a low carb diet, to a ketogenic diet. And then just through continued interest in sort of just, I guess some of it's serendipity, stumbled across a lot of people that were, seemed to be thriving on this sort of crazy, bizarre meat-only diet that, you know, when I started reading about it, you know, had the same reservations, thought it was, well, this sounds a little bit nutty. But then really just looked into what was going on and looking at the results. And I really, you know, sort of like where the rubber meets the road, I put results above anything else. And I saw that they were, you know, at least by their admission, getting excellent results, even beyond what people were seeing on a ketogenic diet. In fact, many people were coming from ketogenic diets to that diet and finally seeing resolution of all kinds of health issues. And then I saw that there was some potential for improvements in athletic performance. And I kind of did some research looking back in time, and athletes that had done this over the, you know, the years that had gone back and kind of had been forgotten about. Tried it for 30 days. And, you know, this is after doing it for short periods of time, a few days here, a week here. I think I'd gone 15 days at one stretch and always felt good on it. And so I did it for 30 days, about a little over 3 years ago. And at that time, I had just started to have, you know, a reasonable sized social media following, several thousand people. And we kind of kidded about what I was going to die of, heart attack, my colon was going to fall out from lack of fiber, you know,
Right.
all these scurvy, all these things. And of course, none of that happened. And, you know, and then I, you know, I did it for my 30 days and said, well, that was neat. And then I decided to go back to what I was doing before. And I literally just didn't feel very good relatively. And I thought, well, you know, all things being equal, I'm not really concerned about, or I mean, I understand the nuance around high fat and cholesterol and you know, saying that I really value feeling good and performing well, you know, particularly as I got older. I like not having sore joints and liked waking up every day with energy and, you know, all the things that I felt like I was 20 years younger, literally. So I just decided to keep going with that. And then obviously it's, you know, for whatever reason, I got some fortune to be on some higher profile, you know, media and I guess inspired some other people to try it. And now we've got literally, you know, tens upon tens of thousands of people that have, you know, done it and generally have had very good success with it.
Yeah, you've really kind of taken the world by storm, because I've had other carnivores. I mean, this podcast is probably 6 years old now, and I've had other carnivores on here. I've had Amber O'Hearn, I've had, I can't even think of some of the other ones, even in those early days, but none of them had seemed to have had the kind of the widespread impact that your message is having. Do you, what do you attribute that to?
Well, I mean, for good or bad, I mean, being an MD does give you at least some credibility, in this. And
Sure.
some people seem to think, well, he's a doctor, he knows more than I do. And I mean, truth be told, with nutrition, that's not necessarily true. Although, I mean, I understand human physiology, disease process, and so I do have, more training, more background than the average person. I mean, the fact that I was, a world record-setting athlete and doing that as a carnivore, I think is a little bit unique. I'm also, I don't know, maybe it's just my personality. I'm very competitive and I don't back down, and I tend to be a little bit willing to engage with, some of the more, I guess the way I promote it has been, some people describe a little bit aggressive, but I mean, I think honestly, we need to. I mean, we need to push back against this, sort of plant-based message. And I've been willing to, very vocally and very aggressively push back. And so I think that appeals to a lot of people that are, I think, just kind of fed up with some of the nonsense that's out there. And, like I said, the other thing I've done was I was very aware of the fact that nothing seems to, influence people more than, the power of other human experience and sharing those stories. And when I started Meat Heals, which is now MeatRx.com, we just started just saying, hey, this is person after person after person after person who's seen success with all types of diseases. And it gets hard to ignore. Even the most skeptical person at least has to say, wait, well, maybe there's something there, or, maybe these people are, this is special. They acknowledge that it works now. And it's not just, one guy or two guys. It's literally thousands upon thousands. And so that's hard to ignore.
Especially, for me, as I look back over my long journey, I'm not a, record setting athlete or anything, but, I was 400 pounds 6-7 years ago. And it was, every step of the way, all the little adjustments, all the little things I did to my diet, everything that I was doing was taking more and more plants out of my diet. First it was sugar, then it was sugar and grains. Then it was sugar and grains and, seed oils and vegetable oils. And then it was, now it's, it's pretty much just meat. And I'm, my health has done nothing but improve. The less plants that I have in my diet, the better I feel, and the better my health is, and the more weight I lose. So there's something to it. What I tell people when I'm talking to them personally, that the power of the carnivore movement is that it just introduces it as an option. 5 years ago, the idea of just eating meat really wasn't an option for anyone. No one was talking about that. I mean, it was, that was definitely going to kill you. I mean, I listened to keto podcast that were talking about, keep meat as a garnish and only do 4 ounces and, make most of your meals, the spinach and the broccoli and whatnot. Now that idea is going away, especially in the keto fields, that people aren't as scared, even in the high fat community, people aren't as scared of meat now as they were, when I first started this. In fact, I was just thinking, the very first book I ever read on the ketogenic diet was Jimmy Moore's Keto Clarity. And in that, he almost makes you terrified of protein, that protein is going to cause gluconeogenesis. It's going to get you out of ketosis, and you're going to gain weight because you've eaten too much protein. Now I think that idea is really kind of been proven to be wrong, and has kind of been poo-pooed out of the keto sphere. What is gluconeogenesis something you even worry about, think about? Is too much protein something that you are concerned with for you or for anyone else that you talk to?
Well, I think it depends on the person, quite honestly. I mean, I don't worry about much of anything, quite honestly. I mean, gluconeogenesis, yeah, it occurs. It's a normal physiological, process that our body has to produce glucose. Glucose is important for our body. I mean, it's, I know we sort of talk about fat, but we still require glucose for certain physiologic processes. I mean, we're never going to be zero glucose. I mean, that just doesn't happen. I mean, there's Cahill in his research back in the 1960s got some people pretty low. I mean, they saw glucoses of, I think, 20 and 10 when they added insulin infusions in there. And, because of the high ketone levels, they were able to still perform well. But I mean, glucose does have a role. Glucose stability, I think, is important. I think from a disease management standpoint, we don't want these huge glucose spikes. Gluconeogenesis generally results in a very steady, consistent glucose level, which I think is good. I think protein often is regulated by appetite. So I think it's hard with real food to overdose on protein. I mean, I think, if you were to eat a lot of protein powders, you could probably push yourself to where it became problematic. I think there's an acute and a chronic sort of thing. I mean, acute, if you go from, eating 50 grams of protein a day to 400 grams of protein a day, your body is just not going to be able to deal with that big of a change over that rapid period of time. And, so we're going to have some ammonia that maybe we have to deal with. The body, all protein is basically, the nitrogen from the amino acids is converted to ammonia, which is toxic. And then we have to convert that to urea in the liver. I think we're seeing that I think protein is largely demand driven for the most part, but it is dependent upon the supply. And so you can make the glucose you need via gluconeogenesis, particularly from protein. Fat can do it as well with glycerol, and we can sort of recycle lactate. But I mean, protein is probably the most reliable source of gluconeogenesis, and so there's amino acids. And so when I say demand driven, it's your liver will pump out as much glucose as your body generally needs. Right. I think that, again, appetite will tend to regulate that for the most part. I think there are some people that have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes or diabetes in situ, which would be hyperinsulinemia, that we see that glucose tends to run high. And I think what's going on, we know what's going on there is, the glucose is higher in the bloodstream because we're insulin resistant. That means we can't get the insulin in the cells where we need it. And so there are insulin regulated glucose transporters. And then there are some diffusion gradient regulated glucose transporters. Well, there's multiple glucose transporters that go into certain cells. And so the higher glucose levels are just a diffusion gradient. So we need those higher glucose levels to fuel the cells. And we see that with these insulin resistant people. And so when they initially go on a carnivore diet, they have adequate substrate for gluconeogenesis, they will run a little bit higher glucose because they're still fighting this insulin resistance, and they're still, they still require that for an energy source, for the glucose requirements for the cells. I think athletes, when it comes to protein needs, I think athletes, people that are putting on, actively building muscle, are going to need more than someone who's not. That's pretty clear. So, that level of protein you get, I think the more active you are, the more protein you need. The less active you are, probably the less protein you need. Is there a minimum amount of protein you need? I think clearly, the ketogenic diet in its classic form, where it was, protein bad, fat all good, we're going to chug butter and we're going to eat a sliver of protein, was not the right answer. I think there's some, I think even Jimmy Moore has gone on a carnivore diet at this point, and so, I think we're coming to realize that fat is still very much essential. We have to get that, but so is protein. And I think, the sort of the fear of I'm going to be kicked out of ketosis or my blood glucose is going to go up a bit is probably unfounded, quite honestly. I think that, at the end of the day, what are we looking to do? We're looking for actual results. This is where I kind of sometimes get a little frustrated when people are like, they get so hung up on ketone levels and glucose levels and what's this lab showing, what does that lab say? What are you trying to do at the end of the day? And we're trying to, at the end of the day, we're hopefully trying to have, more lean tissue and less fat tissue. We're trying to, feel good. And I think people sort of say, well, that's, that's silly to rely on how you do subjectively. And I think that's quite honestly, silly itself to say that, because I think, how we live and how we feel and how we perform and how we function is everything about life. And this sort of belief that I'm going to tell you, you're going to live longer if you do this or that, is based on no evidence that you can point to in human beings that's ever been done or likely can ever be done. just because we can't do the nutritional studies that would show us that. And so I think we really need to focus on where are we today with regards to our health, and what can we do to improve that? And if we're overweight, obese, and diabetic, or joint pain, and we can go from having that situation to I'm no longer obese, I'm no longer diabetic, I no longer have joint pain, then you have clearly improved your quality of life. You likely improve your health span, and arguably you've probably improved your lifespan.
Right. What are your views on the protein leverage hypothesis, that if you're looking to lose weight, the key to that is to control your appetite, and the key to that is to increase the amount of protein you're eating versus the amount of fat or carbs, sugar?
Yeah, I mean, I think guys like Ted Naiman have championed that. He's got his protein energy ratio. I think certainly protein is extremely important. We know that looking at overfeeding studies, that protein is metabolically very challenging to turn into body fat. So I think protein is a great macronutrient to focus on. I do think there's some degree that the thought is you'll eat until you reach a protein requirement, and then your appetite will shut down. I think in general that works for a lot of people. I don't think it works for everybody, though. I mean, I've seen people that don't do well at that approach, and I think it kind of depends on where you are on that physiologic spectrum. I think some people will find that higher fat meals are more satiating to them. I know for me personally, I can eat, depends. I mean, I find it, that I can eat something like ribeye, which is relatively fatty, but it's not as fatty as like a fatty cut of brisket. And I find that I can't eat as much brisket as I can eat ribeye. And I mean, it's just, and so I find for me, my appetite, I struggle to eat 2 pounds of brisket where I can put down 2 pounds of ribeye without even blinking an eye. So it's kind of interesting how that works. Now, having said that, as an athlete, I eat a lot of protein. I eat 300, 400, sometimes 500-600 grams of protein some days. So I think it's, it depends where you're at. I think as you get leaner and leaner, and you want to lose body fat, then it's really protein and less fat and carbohydrates that kind of get you there. Most people don't need to do that. I think that becomes, these people that are walking around taking pictures of themselves at 7-8% body fat. One, they probably feel miserable. Two, it's not normal human physiology to be that lean. I mean, humans are relatively fat primates. I mean, this is what we are. And the reason for that is because we have this big, huge energy dependent brain. That's, we've got a 1200, 1300 cc brain, and the nearest primate has something like 300 cc's, a chimpanzee. So we require more energy, and the way we ensure that energy is to have a little bit more body fat. So that's, a normal human, 10, 12, 15% body fat for a healthy male is probably the sweet spot. And then when you try to get to these lower ranges, you eat in a non-normal human physiologic way, and that's calorie restriction, fat restriction, exercise, these types of things, which I think are not kind of normal.
Yeah, the playing with my protein and fat levels, that's one of the next experiments that I'm going to do for myself, just to see if I can lose a little bit more weight, upping my protein, lowering my fat, just to see what'll happen, because I'm kind of curious what'll happen, and I don't know at this point what'll happen. Let's talk about some of the common problems that people have with the carnivore diet and how you would respond to them. I think probably the most common one is a lack of fiber. Is that something anyone should be worried about?
I think fiber is context dependent. I mean, I think it is relatively better than Twinkies and donuts and ice cream. So I mean fiber from whole food sources. So I think there's that benefit. And I think most of the data that supports fiber is basically epidemiologic studies, which basically may be a marker of just overall healthy behaviors, and this is a so-called healthy user bias. Fiber is completely unnecessary for human survival. I mean, you don't need it. It's not essential. I haven't had it in years. I'm no worse for the wear. In fact, my health has continued to get better. I think I continually see people whose health gets better, particularly their GI health, if they've got GI problems when they exclude fiber. I think that you know, the thought that we have to eat something that's indigestible is somehow appropriate for us. The sort of the arguments for fiber over the years, it lowers your cholesterol, it lowers your blood pressure, it helps you lower the weight. When you do interventional trials, those results are modest at best with regards to improvements, and in many of them they're no improvement at all, or even a negative. And so the latest sort of pro fiber argument is this gut microbiome, and the fact that these bacteria will convert fiber to a short chain fatty acid, particularly butyrate, and that appears to be helpful to colonocytes, which are the cells that line the colon. Is interesting, but I mean, there's a lot of ways to get butyrate to those cells. I mean, there's, just being on a diet where ketones are produced. One of the main, blood-borne ketone is beta hydroxybutyrate, which is basically butyrate with a hydroxyl, a molecule attached to it. And that's a very easily reversible reaction, so that there's free interchange between beta hydroxybutyrate and butyrate. And so if you produce any amount of ketones, and a carnivore diet will produce some ketones, those cells see that butyrate regardless. I mean, also we know that amino acids can and are converted by gut bacteria in the gut into short chain fatty acids, as well as things like propionate, acetate, and then also methylbutyrate. And so, and again, this is, there's a lot of ways to get this butyrate. You can eat butter and get butyrate. I mean, it's butyric acid. This is just a hydrogen ion away. So we've got these. This is just I think more marketing than anything else. Fiber. I mean, there's a number of studies that show that fiber is potentially negative. I mean, Dr. Ann Peary did a nice study, colonoscopy study, looking at a couple thousand patients where they ran colonoscopies, and then they found the people that ate the most fiber, that had the most number of bowel movements, had the highest percentage of diverticular disease. So it's kind of like, what do we actually look at when we have fiber? I mean, fiber, the observation of fiber was healthy was back to Dr. I think Dennis Burkitt back in the 1940s, where he was traveling through parts of Africa, and he observed tribes that were eating a lot of fiber, and found the ones that ate a lot of fiber had less health problems. But John Yudkin observed the fact they weren't eating sugar, and said, well, maybe that's it. And so we know the story where Yudkin was kind of shut out, and the anti-fat guys, the sugar lobby paid Harvard and Fred Astaire to promote sugar and vilify fat. And I think fiber is just another one of those things that went with that.
I know that our knowledge of the gut microbiome is negligible. I mean, there's almost nothing there. Have you come across any studies that look at how a carnivore diet, say 3 months in length or more, affects the gut microbiome, or because I don't think that I have.
Yeah, I mean, there are some studies out there that have looked at that. I mean, there's some population studies. In fact, there were studies looking at Inuit Eskimos eating a traditional diet, which is basically a carnivore diet, and they saw that their gut microbiome diversity was completely fine. And there's no, I mean, their diversity was just as diverse as anyone else's. I mean, I've seen microbiome analysis on many people on the carnivore diet, and generally the same thing I see is good diversity. A high percentage of these quote unquote good bacteria. But I think that the microbiome is largely a wild goose chase. I think I think about it like, look, you've got a system in there where there are arguably billions of bacteria and thousands of species all interacting, all which is highly modifiable by many things in the environment, changes even by the hour. That system is so complicated. And we compare that to, say, cholesterol, which we've been studying for 100 years, and we still can't even figure out cholesterol yet. We're still debating about which type of cholesterol, which particle cholesterol, which is, literally orders of magnitude less complicated than this microbiome. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a fool's errand to try to be prescriptive about the microbiome, try to modify it in any meaningful way. I don't think we're going to be able to get to a point where we can, say that this microbiome is better. I mean, I think the most simplest way to look at it is say, look, when you're healthy, your microbiome is healthy. We're kind of putting the cart before the horse by saying the only way you can be healthy is if you have this many Prevotella and this many, Firmicutes and, whatever numbers we're looking at. I think that's kind of nonsense sort of ways of practicing things. I think we just look at, what people are diseased and what people are not diseased, and what are we doing to change those things. And I think that, a lot of the fecal microbiota transplants have shown that maybe the success rates aren't as good. Maybe it helps a little bit with C. difficile infections, but beyond that, the results are pretty mixed. Some of the studies on mice where they looked at that, they had to retract those studies. I saw a recent study looking at, just stool samples, and they saw that the stool samples where they tried to predict what the microbiome didn't even match the biopsies. So they would compare stool samples to biopsies and said, they're not even congruent. So, I mean, even the information we're getting from taking these stool samples may not even match what's actually going on. So I'm not real particularly excited about the microbiome, quite honestly.
Okay, let's talk about in the early days. I haven't heard it, recently, probably in the last year, but I know in those early days when you're first starting, to kind of get this message out there, one of the complaints that people had against you was that you had given yourself type 2 diabetes because you put out, some blood tests and your A1C was higher than normal. What happened there, and what can you say that is going on now with that?
Well, it's I just got a CGM sent to me by this company, so I'll explore and look at that. But I mean, a couple of things. One, we know that A1C is not all that particularly reliable for, assessment of blood glucose. I mean, more and more people are starting to realize that it's not all that as good of a test as we thought it was. Two, when we look at my overall, physiology, there's a pathophysiology that goes with diabetes. And so we typically see hyperinsulinemia, we see hyperglycemia, we see, pathognomonic physiology changes, and I had none of those things. I mean, like I said, my insulin was 2.6 fasting insulin. I mean, it was extremely low. If you calculate my insulin resistance levels, a HOMA-IR score, for instance, it was 0.8, which is anything below 1 is considered optimal from an insulin resistance standpoint. You can calculate my triglyceride glucose index, which was also like optimal for insulin sensitivity. Same thing with my LPIR score based on my lipid lipoproteins. So, I mean, I'm extremely insulin sensitive. And so the question is, why would your blood glucose be high on a fasting morning glucose? And, when we look at some of the athlete literature that's come out now in recent years using things like CGMs, we see that many high-level athletes, particularly if they engage in certain sporting activities like high-intensity sprinting, which is what I do. I mean, literally setting world records in sprinting. We see that they have often elevated blood glucose, and this is something that I think is sort of an athletic physiology versus a diabetic pathophysiology. In fact, what I would see is, my highest glucoses would be in the morning, and then I got a little, little glucose monitor, and I checked them, and I would see throughout the day it was 80, 75. After a meal, it wouldn't rise at all. Sometimes it would go down. It would go from, I'd be sitting at 90, it would go down to 85, or, it would go from 85 to 91 or something like that. So I see almost no elevation. So I had really stable blood glucose, very stable postprandial numbers. When I woke up in the morning, it would bump up, and because usually I would train early in the morning. So there's sort of this anticipatory knowing that my body knows it's going to need to do this highly glycolytic activity early in the morning. And I think that's what we see. It'll be interesting. I'll follow up. I'll put the CGM on and we'll see further on that. But, the other thing is, if you go back and look at physiology of Inuits, you go back to the metabolic studies from the 1920s, and they studied the Inuit, and they had no diabetes at all in their population, but they would have a fasting AM glucose often in the 120s, which was the same thing I saw. And they were eating on average somewhere between 4 and 8 pounds of meat a day. These little Inuit guys that were, so I think that's sort of maybe possibly normal physiology for that situation. I mean, The concern would be if you were diabetic and a type 2 diabetic, first of all, I mean, I wouldn't have an insulin that low. I'm not a type 1 diabetic because that would mean I would need it, I would need insulin so I don't have any of those things. And so it's kind of like all the endocrinologists and doctors like, well, we can't figure out why it would be high because it doesn't make sense with the rest of the physiology.
Your A1C is calculated with the with the assumption that the average blood cell lasts 90 days, lives for 90 days. Is there anything to the idea that perhaps if you're eating a very low sugar, diet, that perhaps your blood cells can survive for longer, 100 days, 120 days?
Yeah, I mean, that's there absolutely. I mean, there's some thought behind that, and there's some research that supports that. I mean, some people would say a fructosamine would be another test that might be more appropriate. I think the CGM is probably going to be the best answer because we're seeing repeatedly people that will have CGMs where if you would say this is what the calculation should be based on my CGM, maybe my hemoglobin A1C should be 4.8, but when I measured it, it was 5.7 or something like that, right?
Okay.
And that just shows you that maybe there is something to the cells are living longer, and obviously the longer they stay around, the hemoglobin A1C assumes it's 90 days, but if the cells are living 120, 130, 140 days, and it's going to overestimate that glucose level. So I think CGM is probably, my view is probably right now the gold standard for looking at what your blood glucose is.
All right, let's talk about vitamin C for a minute. We laugh about the carnivores, going to drop dead from scurvy and whatnot. Obviously, that's not going on. Is vitamin C important? Does meat provide vitamin C? What's happening there?
Well, I mean, if you don't have enough vitamin C relative to your requirements, then you get disease, and then ultimately scurvy. And scurvy, is a life-threatening disease that people die from. So I've yet to see anybody on the carnivore diet eating, outside of, some isolated cases where people in poor countries were eating like beef jerky and surviving on Spam and junk food. I mean, I've not seen scurvy in anybody on the carnivore diet, I mean, and again, people say, well, you may be suboptimal and there may be, and that's a different debate. But so I think the requirements for vitamin C are higher on a carbohydrate-based diet. I think there's several reasons for that. It's also known that, it's been known 100 plus years that fresh meat basically both prevented and cured scurvy, back from these Arctic explorers. I think the reason that these quote unquote limeys, these British sailors were getting scurvy on their long boat voyages where they were eating dried meat. I mean, they were eating dried meat and they were eating a high carb diet. And I think those combinations are something where scurvy can be a problem. We know that, even though the USDA doesn't recognize any vitamin C in red meat, outside of things like liver and some other organs, but I mean, as far as muscle meat's concerned, but when it's been tested independently outside the USDA never actually tested it, but it's been tested in other places. It seems to indicate there's about I think 10 milligrams per pound of red meat, muscle meat in particular. So, that alone is probably enough to prevent scurvy. Okay. The question becomes what's optimal, what's suboptimal, is there something like that? And I think that's very much contentious. There are a lot of mechanisms by which, maybe vitamin C requirements go down in a non-carbohydrate-based metabolism. I don't know if we have time to get into all of them, but that's kind of the overshot of that.
Are there any supplements that you would recommend someone who's maybe new to the carnivore diet taking?
In general, I don't generally think there's any real requirement for supplementation. I mean, from a clinical standpoint, I think if you want to hit your RDA of certain nutrients, and I don't think the RDAs are accurate for a carnivore population, but if you did, you could certainly get all those from foods. I mean, you could if you're worried about folate, you could eat liver. If you're worried about vitamin A or vitamin C, liver would be another good source of that. You can get some of the vitamin Ks and vitamin Ds and stuff like that from some dairy. You can include fish in there. There's a lot of ways to make the diet nutritionally complete from an RDA standpoint. But honestly, I've just seen too many people thriving on basically a diet of steaks and burgers and not having any signs or symptoms of clinical deficiencies. So I think it's kind of individual dependent. I think that sometimes electrolytes can be helpful, particularly in a transition period, and particularly for athletes. I think that if someone comes to the diet already nutritionally depleted, then maybe supplementation, either with food or supplements, can be a benefit. But I just, I I just think you have to be objective about it. I think one of the problems is even if you tested serologically low for something, like a vitamin D is a great example. So many people believe that low vitamin D is going to cause problems, and that may or may not be true depending on the population. There was a good study, again, looking at this Inuit population in Greenland, and they saw some that these guys are exposed to long periods of no sun. They're 6 months out of the year, it's very little sunlight, and so they often will have lower vitamin D levels. But when they looked at two populations, one of those populations ate the traditional diet of marine mammals and caribou or reindeer or those types of things. And despite low levels of vitamin D, they had no signs or symptoms of clinical vitamin D deficiencies, namely things like rickets. There was another population of Inuit who had the exact same level of vitamin D in their blood, the same low levels, but because in addition to the regular food, they were eating grains and flour and sugar and canned goods, they then developed vitamin D clinical deficiency symptoms of rickets. And this is, even with the exact same serological levels. So I think again, this is all what our needs are relative to what our diet is, I think there's more to it than we think. And I think, even the blood levels lower levels may be completely sufficient on a different type of diet.
Okay. So last question. There's, I guess, a bit of a controversy within the carnivore community. Some say that you should really eat nose to tail, include organ meats, liver, things like that. And others are like, just eat hamburger meat and steaks, and not even that. I mean, I know people who just eat hamburger meat; they're fine. What do you say to this?
Well, I think again, the people that have been doing this the longest, the people that have had a lot of experience with this, will probably be in that latter camp. It's just like, just eat a bunch of red meat and good. I do think that some people will benefit from eating organ meats. I mean, I think clearly there are people that will and have demonstrated that it's helpful. So I think the blanket statement that they're necessary for everybody, I think, is incorrect. I do think they are beneficial, can be beneficial. Obviously, they're very good sources of nutrients. But to say that all people across the board need to do that, I think is not match reality. I think it's more theoretical. I think that, this nose to tail approach, I'm fully supportive of people that want to do that. Is it required? I don't believe it is. And I think that the clinical results seem to indicate that. I've surveyed the carnivore population. I did a survey. I got something like 11,000 responses in like 24 hours. And 85% of the people doing the diet either never or rarely ate organ meats. Only 15% were eating them in any kind of frequency. When I say decent frequency, it would be once a week. So everybody else is eating it either never, less than once a week, or maybe once a month. And so to say that it is an absolute necessity is in my view incorrect. To say that it's going to help you to be optimized also, I think, is potentially incorrect. I think, but I do think some people benefit from that. So I think it's important to assess yourself personally. Do you need to do so? Because a lot of people just quite honestly don't find it appealing. And I think, I don't care how nutritious something is, if it tastes like death, not death, but if it just tastes awful, you're not going to eat it. And I think there's people that, I just think there are people that never really ate it throughout history because they didn't like it. And, particularly when it wasn't subsistence eating. I think there's a difference in subsistence patterns where we view these indigenous society tribes that are living on the fringes and basically, one step away from starvation. They eat everything they can get. Whereas when there was times of surplus, and I would argue early man saw a lot of times of surplus, particularly when they had lots of megafaunal animals to hunt and were very good at hunting them and probably never ran out of food, in my view. I think they just probably, killed a big animal, ate on it for 2-3 months. And when they started to get low, they went out and killed another one. And I think I don't think they were starving. I don't think starving was compatible with growing a big brain. I just don't think these periods of starvation, feasting and fasting, I think you had to be consistently getting good nutrition to consistently grow, to put 1,200 cc's of brain matter in our going from 300 cc's.
That's interesting. Do you think do you have any problems with intermittent fasting or fasting for 2-3 days at a time?
Not, look, I think normal human physiology is not the physiology of someone who's 400 pounds. If you've got to 400 pounds, you've obviously done things that aren't physiologically normal. And I think for those people, fasting can be a benefit. I think for the average lean person that's at normal body weight and normal, I think that's unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. I think that, we have an appetite for a reason. Like I said, if you're eating a species appropriate diet and you're hungry, then you should probably eat again. I just think it's that simple. I think that's why every other animal does that on the planet. Humans are different because we just, we've invented our food. We don't eat what's available to us now. We just invented this stuff. And so we've got this really messed up system. And so now we have to fast, to get back to normal physiology.
Well, Dr. Baker, I said I'd get you up in 45 minutes. It looks like we've hit our time. I really appreciate you coming on. Can you tell my listeners where they can find more about you, the name of your book, anything else like that?
Sure, of course. So I'm on social media on Instagram, Shawn, SHAWN, Baker, BAKER, 1967. I'm on Twitter at SBakerMD, and it's capital S, capital B, and then MD in capital. I've got a YouTube channel, which I upload a video to almost every morning, Shawn Baker. MeatRx.com is our website, our coaching platform, our support platform, our resource platform for all things carnivore diet and health related. I'm there every single morning doing a live talk with all my members. Usually have 50, 60, 70, 80 people in the chat just doing that. That is where I'm at every single day if you want to interact with me live. I do consultations for people that want to do that. That's through my website, shawn-baker.com. And then finally, the book, The Carnivore Diet by Shawn Baker, MD, is out. It's been out for a couple of months now, doing very well reviewed. It's on Amazon. It's on many bookstores you can find it in. It's available, and it's in both print and audio version, not print and digital version. An audio version will be coming out here within the next couple months. And I think it's a really effective way to learn about the diet, learn about the rational diet, how to implement the diet. I wrote it to a broad audience, so it's very accessible. It's written in very, I think, understandable language. So I think it's an excellent resource, and it's just a straight to it. How does this work? How do you do it? There's not a lot of BS in there. There's plenty of science in there, but it's not a technical, difficult read that some people enjoy that. There's, some people really like to dig into the minutiae of the science. I really think the science is emerging. I think we are a long ways from understanding all this stuff. And I think overly relying on one scientific interpretation is potentially problematic. I think we just have to, just kind of look at the big picture and see what the inputs are, what the outputs are, and realize that the human metabolism, the human physiology is largely still a black box to us. We know a lot, but we don't know it all, and we're a long ways from doing that. So I don't want to, get people mired down in too much technical detail, because I just don't think it's that helpful, quite honestly.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that we're kind of at the beginning stages of trying to figure all this out, but we're making some important strides. So it's exciting to be, to kind of be here at the beginning of this. So Dr. Baker, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate you coming on.
Hey, Art, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. And like I said, I appreciate you giving me the audience and your audience listening, and hopefully more and more people will be open to this message and, try it, and just try it. I like a 90-day trial. I think, the worst is you eat a bunch of steaks for 90 days and there's, not much downside to that.
Nope, not at all. All right, guys, those of you that are listening, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.